In the intricate hierarchy of the American legal system, there exists a delicate balance between those who enforce the law and those who interpret it. Most law enforcement officers understand this distinction instinctively, respecting the separate but complementary roles that police and judiciary play in maintaining social order. But occasionally, an officer forgets this fundamental principle. They begin to believe that carrying a badge grants them authority over the law itself, rather than simply the power to enforce it. When this happens, the consequences can be swift, severe, and career-defining. This is the story of one such officer, a man whose 15 years of street experience convinced him that he understood the law better than a judge with 3.5 decades on the bench. What transpired in Judge Frank Caprio's Providence courtroom on a spring Wednesday morning would become a defining case study in professional boundaries, judicial authority, and the dangers of confusing enforcement with interpretation. Providence Municipal Court handles hundreds of cases each week: traffic violations, parking infractions, minor disputes that form the mundane machinery of urban governance. Most proceedings follow predictable patterns. Defendants appear, evidence is presented, judgments are rendered, and life continues. Wednesday, March 23rd, began no differently. Judge Frank Caprio, at 76 years old, arrived at his courthouse office at 7:30 a.m., as he had for over 3 decades. His morning routine was unchanging: review case files, prepare questions, consider precedents, and approach each defendant with the presumption that everyone deserves fair hearing and dignified treatment. At 10:45 a.m., the courtroom doors opened with unusual force. The bailiff glanced up, accustomed to recognizing the body language of defendants before they even approached the bench. What he saw made him pause. Sergeant Derek Thompson, 38 years old, strode into the courtroom with the bearing of someone who believed he was entering territory where his authority remained undiminished. His Providence Police Department uniform was immaculately pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his entire demeanor radiated the confidence, or perhaps arrogance, of someone who had spent 15 years being the ultimate authority in every interaction. Thompson was there to contest a parking citation. 3 weeks earlier, while off duty and driving his personal vehicle, he had parked in a designated handicapped space outside a popular lunch restaurant. A parking enforcement officer, unimpressed by Thompson's off-duty police identification, had issued a standard citation: $300 plus court costs. Most people would have paid the fine and moved on. But Thompson wasn't most people. He had come to court with a fundamentally flawed understanding of how legal authority works, and he was about to receive an education that would fundamentally alter his career. As Thompson approached the defendant's stand, experienced courtroom observers noted several concerning details. He didn't remove his police cap, a basic gesture of respect in any courtroom. He kept his hand resting on his duty belt in a posture more suited to a traffic stop than a legal proceeding. His badge remained prominently displayed, as though he expected it to function as a talisman against accountability. Judge Caprio looked up from his paperwork with the patient expression of someone who had seen virtually every variation of human behavior pass through his courtroom. "Sergeant Thompson," the judge began, his voice carrying the measured authority developed over 35 years on the bench. "You're charged with parking in a designated handicapped space while off duty, in violation of City Ordinance 12-7. The violation occurred on March 15th at 1:30 p.m. outside Tony's restaurant on Federal Hill. How do you plead?" Thompson's response immediately signaled that this would not be a routine proceeding. "Your Honor," he said, his tone suggesting he was about to explain something obvious to someone who had somehow missed it. "I'm pleading not guilty because this citation represents a fundamental misapplication of parking enforcement policies as they relate to sworn law enforcement personnel." Judge Caprio set down his pen. never a positive sign for defendants attempting to lecture him about legal matters. Sergeant Thompson, were you on duty at the time of this violation? No, Your Honor. But as a sworn police officer, I maintain certain responsibilities and authorities that require flexible interpretation of civilian parking restrictions. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Thompson had just suggested that his police status exempted him from laws that applied to everyone else, even when he was off duty and driving his personal vehicle. Sergeant Thompson, Judge Caprio continued, his voice remaining calm. Were you responding to an emergency or conducting official police business at the time? Thompson's irritation became visible. Not at that specific moment, Your Honor. But law enforcement officers must be prepared to respond to situations that civilians cannot handle. This requires certain operational flexibilities. Judge Caprio's expression didn't change, but veteran court watchers recognized the subtle signs of a judge preparing to deliver a legal education. Sergeant Thompson, can you cite the specific statute or regulation that exempts off-duty police officers from handicapped parking requirements? Thompson paused, clearly unprepared for this level of scrutiny. Your Honor, with all due respect, police operational protocols supersede municipal parking ordinances. Any experienced law enforcement professional would understand this. The silence that followed was profound. Thompson had just condescendingly suggested that Judge Caprio, a man who had been interpreting law since before Thompson entered elementary school, lacked understanding of legal hierarchies. But Thompson wasn't finished compounding his error. Your Honor, he continued, his voice taking on an openly dismissive tone, I've been enforcing these laws on the street for 15 years. I think I have a better practical understanding of how they're supposed to work than someone who only sees them from behind a bench. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Thompson had just insulted Judge Caprio's comprehension of the law and suggested that street-level enforcement experience was superior to judicial expertise. What happened next would systematically dismantle Thompson's arrogance and potentially end his supervisory career. Judge Caprio slowly removed his glasses, a gesture those familiar with his courtroom recognized as significant. He set them down with deliberate precision and looked directly at Thompson with an expression of calm, measured authority. Sergeant Thompson, the judge said, his voice remaining perfectly controlled, I want to ensure I understand your position correctly. Are you arguing that your 15 years of police experience give you greater authority to interpret the law than this court? Thompson, mistaking the judge's measured tone for uncertainty, doubled down on his disrespect. Your Honor, I'm simply stating that practical law enforcement requires understanding legal applications that might not be apparent from a purely academic or theoretical perspective. Judge Capri nodded slowly, as if carefully considering Thompson's words. I see. Sergeant Thompson, since you've questioned this court's understanding of law enforcement and legal interpretation, allow me to ask you some questions about your case. The judge opened a thick file that had been resting on his desk throughout the proceeding. Sergeant Thompson, you mentioned 15 years of police experience. Can you tell me your current rank and assignment? Thompson straightened his shoulders with evident pride. Sergeant, Your Honor, Traffic Division Supervisor. Traffic Division, Judge Caprio repeated. So you supervise the enforcement of traffic and parking violations? Yes, Your Honor, among other duties. Sergeant Thompson, in your supervisory role, how do you instruct your officers to handle off-duty law enforcement personnel who violate parking laws? Thompson hesitated, sensing he was walking into a carefully constructed trap. Your Honor, we handle each situation based on its specific circumstances. That's not what I asked, Sergeant. Do you tell your officers that off-duty police personnel are exempt from handicapped parking laws? Thompson's confident demeanor began cracking. Your Honor, There are operational considerations. Yes or no, Sergeant Thompson? Do you instruct your officers that police badges exempt people from handicapped parking laws when they're off duty? No, Your Honor. No, you don't. Because there is no such exemption in Rhode Island law, is there, Sergeant? The arrogance began draining from Thompson's face as he realized he was being systematically dismantled by someone who knew the law far better than he did. Your Honor, I believe officer discretion. Sergeant Thompson, Judge Caprio interrupted, his voice gaining authority. You're not a patrol officer exercising discretion. You're a defendant in my courtroom arguing that you're above the law. There's a significant difference. Judge Caprio pulled another document from his file. Sergeant Thompson, since you've questioned this court's understanding of law enforcement, I took the liberty of reviewing your professional record and your department's policies. Thompson's face visibly paled. He clearly hadn't expected his police record to become part of these proceedings. According to the Providence Police Department Manual, Section 4.23, off-duty officers are explicitly required to follow all civilian laws and regulations. Were you aware of this policy, Sergeant? The courtroom fell completely silent as Thompson realized the scope of his legal and professional miscalculation. Your Honor, yes, but... Furthermore, Sergeant Thompson, Judge Caprio continued with devastating precision. According to your internal affairs file, you've received 2 previous reprimands for what your supervisors termed abuse of authority and unprofessional conduct toward civilians. Does that sound familiar? Thompson tried to speak, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. One of these reprimands specifically mentions your belief that police status exempts you from rules that apply to other citizens, and your disrespectful attitude toward legal authority. The Internal Affairs Report recommends additional training in professional boundaries and legal compliance. Thompson's arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine concern as he realized his career was under direct scrutiny. Your Honor, I don't see how my personnel file relates to a parking violation. Oh, but it relates perfectly, Sergeant Thompson. You see, you've demonstrated in my courtroom the exact same abuse of authority and disrespect for legal systems that has already gotten you in trouble with your own department. Judge Caprio's voice grew stronger, carrying the full weight of his judicial authority. You questioned my understanding of the law based on your 15 years of experience. You suggested that your badge gives you special privileges. You've shown the same superiority complex that has already damaged your professional record. Sergeant Thompson, Judge Caprio announced, not only am I finding you guilty of the handicapped parking violation and imposing the full $300 fine plus court costs, but I'm also finding you in contempt of court for your disrespectful conduct and abuse of your official position. Thompson's mouth opened in shock, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Furthermore, Sergeant Thompson, I'm directing court administration to forward a complete transcript of today's proceedings to the Providence Police Department Internal Affairs Division, along with my judicial recommendation that you receive additional training in legal compliance and professional conduct. The courtroom buzzed with reactions as Thompson began to comprehend the full implications. But, more importantly, Judge Caprio continued, standing to deliver his final assessment. I'm recommending that the police department review your fitness for supervisory duties. Given your fundamental misunderstanding of legal authority and your documented pattern of believing that your badge exempts you from the rules that govern everyone else. Thompson looked devastated. Your Honor, you can't destroy my career over a parking ticket. Sergeant Thompson, I'm not destroying your career. You destroyed your career the moment you decided to argue with a sitting judge about the law, while demonstrating fundamental ignorance of both legal principles and your own department's policies. Judge Caprio walked closer to the defendant's stand, his full judicial authority on display. Sergeant Thompson, let me share something with you about legal authority and professional respect. I've been practicing law for 45 years. I've been on this bench for 35 years. I've handled over 400,000 cases, including criminal cases involving police officers, internal affairs investigations, and disciplinary hearings for law enforcement personnel. The judge's voice took on the tone of a disappointed commander addressing a failed officer. In all those years, I've learned that the most dangerous law enforcement officers are those who believe their badge makes them above the law, above accountability, and above the very legal system they've sworn to serve and protect. Thompson stood frozen, his earlier swagger completely destroyed. You walked into my courtroom today thinking you could intimidate a judge with your badge and your 15 years of experience. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why your own department has repeatedly disciplined you for abuse of authority. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, preparing to deliver his final judgment. A police officer who shows disrespect for judicial authority is the same officer who shows disrespect for constitutional rights. A sergeant who thinks parking laws don't apply to him is the same sergeant who thinks other laws are suggestions rather than requirements. The judge picked up his gavel. Sergeant Thompson, your $300 fine is now $800 with court costs. Your contempt citation carries an additional $500 penalty. But most importantly, you'll be explaining to Internal Affairs why a sitting judge has serious concerns about your understanding of legal authority and professional boundaries. Thompson's voice was barely audible. Your Honor, please. I'm not finished, Sergeant. You mentioned that 15 years of street experience gives you better understanding of the law than judicial interpretation. Let me tell you what I understand after 35 years of applying the law. Respect for legal authority isn't optional. Professional humility isn't weakness. And no badge, no matter how shiny, exempts anyone from basic accountability. Judge Caprio looked out at the packed courtroom, which included several other police officers who had come to observe their colleagues' hearing. Let this be a lesson to every law enforcement officer watching. Your badge is a symbol of service, not supremacy. Your oath is to protect and serve, not to exempt yourself from the laws you've sworn to uphold. Your authority comes from the people and the Constitution, not from your uniform. He looked back at Thompson, who stood with his head bowed in complete humiliation. Sergeant Thompson, I strongly recommend that you spend some time reflecting on why respect for the legal system and humility in the face of lawful authority are not optional for law enforcement officers. The badge doesn't make you above the law. It makes you more accountable to it. Judge Caprio raised his gavel. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. As the courtroom emptied, Thompson stood alone at the defendant's table, staring at the citation that had just cost him $1,300 and potentially his supervisory position. The superiority complex that had carried him through 15 years of police work had been systematically dismantled by a 76-year-old judge who never raised his voice. Captain Maria Rodriguez, Thompson's commanding officer, had been sitting in the gallery throughout the entire proceeding. She approached Thompson as he gathered his belongings, her expression reflecting both disappointment and professional concern. Sergeant Thompson, she said quietly, I watched the entire hearing. That judge just demonstrated the kind of professional respect and legal knowledge that you've consistently failed to show in your supervisory role. Thompson looked up at her, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Captain, I didn't mean for it to escalate like that. Derek, this is exactly what I've been trying to address in your performance reviews. Your belief that the badge makes you special, your disrespect for civilian authority, your fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to serve and protect. As Thompson walked out of the courthouse, local news reporters who had witnessed his professional humiliation followed with cameras. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues who had watched the live-streamed proceedings. The video of his legal destruction would be viewed over 2 million times within 24 hours. Law enforcement blogs analyze Judge Caprio's systematic dismantling of Thompson's arrogance as a perfect example of judicial authority properly checking police misconduct. Police academies began using the exchange as training material about the importance of humility and legal compliance in law enforcement. Within days, Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation into Thompson's fitness for supervisory duties. The department's review, combined with Judge Caprio's judicial recommendation, led to Thompson's removal from supervisory responsibilities and mandatory retraining in constitutional law and professional conduct. 3 weeks later, Thompson appeared before the police department's disciplinary board. The transcript of his courtroom behavior, combined with his previous reprimands, painted a picture of an officer whose arrogance posed a genuine threat to public trust and departmental integrity. The board's decision was decisive. Thompson was demoted from sergeant to patrol officer, placed on probationary status for 1 year, and required to complete 40 hours of continuing education in constitutional law, professional ethics, and civilian relations. His annual salary decreased by $18,000. His supervisory authority was revoked. His reputation within the department was severely damaged, all because he had confused 15 years of enforcing the law with understanding it. Officer Thompson's return to the courthouse 6 months later represented a study in transformation. Gone was the arrogant sergeant who had challenged Judge Caprio's authority. In his place stood a humbled patrol officer who had learned that respect for the legal system wasn't merely professional courtesy. It was the foundation of legitimate law enforcement. "Your Honor," Thompson said, standing before Judge Caprio with genuine remorse, "I want to formally apologize for my conduct 6 months ago. I was arrogant, disrespectful, and completely out of line. The consequences of my behavior have taught me that wearing a badge means serving the law, not being above it." Judge Caprio nodded approvingly. "Officer Thompson, apology accepted. What you've learned about respect and humility will make you a better police officer and a better servant of the public." The transformation of Derek Thompson became a case study in Rhode Island law enforcement circles. He eventually completed his probationary period and earned back his colleagues' respect through consistent demonstration of professional humility and strict adherence to legal protocols. Years later, Thompson would tell police academy recruits, "Judge Caprio didn't end my career to humiliate me. He humbled me to save my career and protect the integrity of law enforcement. He taught me that the badge doesn't grant privileges. It creates responsibilities. And the most important responsibility is respecting the legal system we've sworn to serve." The video of that Wednesday morning became one of the most watched law enforcement accountability moments ever recorded, shared millions of times across social media platforms. Police departments around the world used it as training material about the importance of professional boundaries and respect for judicial authority. But for those who knew Judge Caprio personally, it was simply another example of what made him exceptional: the ability to discipline with dignity, to teach through justice, and to transform professional arrogance into professional accountability. He proved that true authority doesn't come from intimidation or position, but from knowledge, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that make the legal system function. In a time when police-community relations are often strained, Judge Frank Caprio demonstrated that accountability serves everyone, officers, courts, and citizens alike. He reminded everyone watching that respect for the law isn't just what we demand from the public. It's what we must demonstrate from those entrusted to enforce it. The lesson was clear. The badge is a symbol of service, earned through public trust and maintained through professional humility. The moment an officer begins believing that badge exempts them from the very laws they enforce, they cease to serve justice and instead threaten it. Sergeant Derek Thompson learned this lesson the hard way, but he learned it before his arrogance caused irreparable harm to himself, to citizens he served, or to the profession he had chosen. That Wednesday morning in Providence Municipal Court, justice was served not through punishment alone, but through education. A police officer who believed he was above the law discovered he was, in fact, more accountable to it than ordinary citizens. And a judge who had spent 35 years balancing compassion with accountability demonstrated why respect for legal authority remains the cornerstone of a functioning democracy.